The sound of my palm slapping against my burning cheek echoed through the dining room. For a moment, everything froze. The steam rising from the lasagna, my father's fork suspended halfway to his mouth, and my stepmother's hand still hanging in the air between us. The silence that followed was deafening. "You're turning into her," Sarah hissed, her words dripping with venom. I stood there, stunned, as the sting spread across my face. But what hurt infinitely more was my father's response. Absolutely nothing. He just sat there, eyes fixed on his plate, as if studying the layers of pasta would somehow make this moment disappear. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply set down the serving spoon, grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door, and left without a word. The screen door's soft click behind me felt like the period at the end of a chapter I never wanted to read again. That slap wasn't just about tonight. It was the culmination of 3 years of subtle digs, comparisons, and the slow erasure of my mother from our lives. And my father's silence? That was the real betrayal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to how this day began. The day that would change everything. Morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains as I stared at the calendar on my phone. 3 years ago today, my mother took her last breath in the hospital bed we'd set up in our living room. Her final words to me were barely audible, but I'll never forget them. "Remember who you are, Emma. Remember who I am." At the time, I thought it was just the medication talking. Now, I wasn't so sure. I scrolled through the photos on my phone, stopping at the last picture we took together at my 14th birthday. People always said we looked alike. Same hazel eyes, same wavy brown hair that never quite behaved, same dimple in our left cheeks when we smiled. I wondered if that's what Sarah saw when she looked at me with those cold blue eyes of hers. A ghost that refused to stay buried. The text from Dad pinged, "Family dinner tonight. Sarah's making her lasagna." 6 sharp. My stomach knotted. Sarah's. Lasagna nights were always tense. They were my mom's specialty, the recipe passed down from her Italian grandmother. But somehow, Sarah had improved it, according to my father. I knew better than to mention that the original was better. I spent the day at community college, half listening to lectures about American literature and psychology. My mind kept drifting to the dinner ahead. Should I make an excuse? Claim a study group? But I knew avoiding home only made things worse when I eventually returned. By the time I pulled into our driveway at 5:45, my hands were already clammy on the steering wheel. Our house looked like every other middle-class home in Dalzei. Suburban Pennsylvania, 2-story colonial, neatly trimmed lawn, American flag by the door. The picture of normalcy. No one driving by would guess what went on inside. I sat in my car for an extra minute, practicing the bland smile I'd perfected over the years. Pleasant but not too happy. Present but not engaged. The facial equivalent of beige wallpaper. "You're late," Sarah said the moment I walked in, though the microwave clock clearly showed 5:50. "Sorry," I mumbled automatically, though I wasn't. "Can I help with anything?" Sarah looked me up and down, her gaze lingering disapprovingly on my jeans and simple blouse. "You could have dressed for dinner, Emma. It wouldn't kill you to put in some effort." My mother used to say my name with such warmth it felt like a hug. From Sarah's lips, it sounded like an accusation. "I came straight from class," I explained, though I knew it didn't matter. Nothing I said ever did. Dad appeared from his study, offering his standard greeting, a distracted pat on my shoulder and a "Hey, kiddo." At 21, I was hardly a kid anymore, but it seemed easier for him to think of me that way. "The table needs setting," Sarah directed, turning back to the oven. "Use the good plates, and for heaven's sake, wash your hands first." I bit back the retort that bubbled up, that I wasn't 5 years old, and headed to the bathroom. Into the mirror. I saw the tension already built up in my shoulders, the tight line of my jaw. "Deep breaths, Emma. Just get through dinner. 2 hours max, then you can leave. As I arranged the good plates, a wedding gift to Sarah and my father, I noticed she'd put out the crystal wine glasses, the ones that had belonged to my mother's family, the ones Sarah had once complained, were outdated and taking up valuable cabinet space. My hands trembled slightly as I positioned them carefully on the table. Dad poured himself a generous glass of red wine, not offering any to me, though I was old enough. Sarah didn't drink. She said it interfered with her wellness regimen, but she never objected to Dad's increasing reliance on his evening glasses. "Emma, tell your father about your grades this semester," Sarah prompted as she adjusted. The centerpiece, a vase of lilies that made my nose itch. Another thing she knew but conveniently forgot. Mom had been allergic to lilies, and I'd inherited that trait. "They're fine," I said, reaching for the water pitcher. "All A's and 1. B in statistics." "A B?" Dad looked up, frowning. "I thought math was your strong subject." Before I could explain about the new professor and his confusing teaching style, Sarah interjected. "I was telling Janice from book club that Emma might want to consider business classes instead of this English literature track. There are actually jobs in business." "I'm getting a teaching degree," I reminded her for what felt like the 100th time. "There are jobs in education, low-paying ones," Sarah said with a thin smile, as if she was concerned for my welfare rather than criticizing my choices. "Let's eat before everything gets cold," Dad suggested, his standard peacekeeping technique. Sarah handed me the oven mitts. "Take out the lasagna, will you, and be careful with it." The casserole dish was heavier than I expected, and I struggled slightly as I carried it to the table. The rich aroma of tomato sauce and cheese filled the dining room, momentarily transporting me to earlier times when Mom would let me sprinkle the final layer of mozzarella. Those memories were becoming fainter with each passing year, like photographs. "Left too long in the sun. I swear you're getting more absent-minded every day," Sarah commented as I nearly bumped into the edge of the table. I managed to set the lasagna down safely on the trivet and reached for the serving spatula. Dad was already pouring himself a second glass of wine. "So, James," Sarah addressed my father, resting her perfectly manicured hand on his forearm. "Did you tell Emma about the promotion?" Dad straightened slightly. "Oh, right. I got the senior architect position at the firm. More money, but more hours too, I'm afraid." "That's great, Dad," I said, genuinely happy for him. Architecture had been his passion for as long as I could remember. Mom used to joke that he loved buildings almost as much as he loved us. "We're thinking of renovating the kitchen to celebrate," Sarah continued. "I've been looking at some designs online." My stomach dropped. The kitchen was the last room my mother had decorated before she got sick. The yellow walls, the vintage-inspired fixtures, all her choices. All about to be erased. "The yellow is so dated," Sarah said, as if reading my thoughts. "I'm thinking gray and white, much more contemporary." I focused on serving the lasagna, carefully cutting a perfect square for each plate. When I came around, to serve Sarah, I had to step behind her chair to reach her plate. That's when it happened. My hip barely grazed her shoulder as I leaned in to set the serving of lasagna on her plate. It was the lightest contact, the kind that happens a dozen times a day in a shared space. But Sarah reacted as if I'd shoved her. She twisted in her chair, her face contorted with sudden rage, and before I could step back, her hand flew up and connected with my cheek. The sound cracked through the room like lightning. "You did that on purpose," she accused, her voice shrill. "Always hovering, always in the way, you're turning into her." The serving spoon clattered onto the table, splattering red sauce across the white tablecloth. The stain spread slowly, like blood from a wound. Dad froze, his wine glass halfway to his lips, his eyes wide but unfocused, looking at the scene but not seeing it. Not really. My cheek burned, but it wasn't just the physical pain that rooted me to the spot. It was the words. "You're turning into her." 4 words that contained a universe of meaning. I waited. 1 heartbeat. 2, for my father to say something. To defend me. To acknowledge what had just happened. To be the parent I desperately needed him to be, but he said nothing. Just sat there, looking down at his plate, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he could physically shrink away from the conflict. In that moment, I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the strong father of my childhood, but as a man who had chosen comfort over courage, who had replaced one family with another, and was determined to ignore the cracks in the foundation of his new life. "James, talk to your daughter," Sarah demanded, her hand now pressed against her chest as if she were the one who had been assaulted. I didn't wait to hear what he might say. Somehow I knew that whatever words might come would only deepen the wound. I simply walked to the door, grabbed my keys from the hook, and left. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of our dining room through the window, Sarah gesturing animatedly, Dad nodding along, both of them illuminated in the warm glow of the chandelier that had once shined over happier family dinners. I drove without a destination in mind, the evening air cool on my still-burning cheek. My mother's last words echoed in my head. "Remember who you are, Emma. Remember who I am." For 3 years I'd tried to keep peace by forgetting, pushing down memories, swallowing words, making myself smaller to fit into the new family picture. Sarah was composing. But in that single stinging moment at the dinner table, something had shifted irreversibly. I wasn't going to forget anymore. And soon, neither would they. As my car headed instinctively toward the familiar streets of my aunt's neighborhood, I made a decision. It was time to open the box of memories I'd kept locked away for too long. Time to make them remember what they'd tried so hard to erase. They thought this dinner was the end of the conversation. They had no idea it was just the beginning. The 20-minute drive to Aunt Maggie's took me across town, from our neat suburban development to the older part of Millfield, where the houses had character instead of conformity. My hands had finally stopped shaking by the time I pulled into her gravel driveway, the crunch under my tires announcing my arrival before I could. Aunt Maggie's craftsman bungalow stood like a weathered guardian among towering oak trees. Its faded blue paint and wraparound porch with mismatched furniture contrasted sharply with Sarah's perfectly coordinated home decor. Mom always said Maggie's house looked authentically lived in, while Sarah would call it cluttered whenever Dad suggested visiting. I barely made it to the porch steps before the front door swung open. Aunt Maggie stood there in paint-splattered overalls, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a messy bun, reading glasses perched on top of her head. One look at my face, and her artist's eyes narrowed. "Who do I need to yell at?" she asked simply. The laugh that escaped me was dangerously close to a sob. "Take a wild guess." She didn't press further, just held the screen door open. "Come on in, honey. I just made some of that ridiculous hot chocolate you like. The one with too many marshmallows." The familiar scent of Maggie's house enveloped me as I stepped inside. Oil, paints, old books, and the lingering aroma of something baked. It smelled like safety, like before. "I wasn't expecting company," she apologized, quickly stacking newspapers from the worn floral couch to make room for me. "Art commission deadline tomorrow. You know how I get." I glanced at the half-finished landscape on her easel by the window. "It's beautiful, Aunt Mags." "It's paying the electric bill, which makes it beautiful enough," she replied pragmatically, disappearing into the kitchen. I heard mugs clinking and the microwave humming as I sank into the couch, my body suddenly recognizing how tense it had been. Maggie returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing me one overflowing with tiny marshmallows, just like Mom used to make when I was upset. She hadn't forgotten. "So," she said, settling beside me, tucking one leg underneath her. "Want to tell me why you're here instead of at the monthly tension convention you call family dinner?" The marshmallows melted slowly as I stared into my mug, searching for where to begin. Sarah slapped me. Maggie's mug froze halfway to her lips. She did what? During dinner. I accidentally brushed against her while serving the food, and she just snapped. The words tumbled out faster now. She said I was turning into her. Into Mom. Jesus, Emma. Maggie set her mug down with a sharp clink. And let me guess, James just sat there? I nodded, the hurt of my father's inaction still raw. Like he didn't even see it happen. That man, Maggie muttered, a world of disappointment in those two words. Catherine would be heartbroken. She rarely mentioned my mother by name, knowing how Sarah had worked to erase her presence from our house, removing photos, repainting rooms, updating furniture. I don't understand him anymore, Aunt Mags. It's like when Mom died, he just checked out. Let Sarah take over everything. I took a sip of hot chocolate, letting the sweetness combat the bitterness rising in my throat. She's been rewriting history ever since, making Mom sound unstable or difficult, and Dad just nods along. Maggie's eyes, so similar to my mother's it sometimes hurt to look directly at them, grew distant. Your father was always conflict avoidant. Catherine used to manage that for him, smooth things over so he never had to face uncomfortable truths. Her voice softened. She protected him, probably more than he deserved. And now he lets Sarah protect him from remembering Mom at all. The realization settled heavily between us. We sat in silence for a moment, the old grandfather clock in the corner marking time with gentle precision. A text alert chimed from my phone. Dad. Where are you? Sarah's upset. We need to talk. I showed it to Maggie, who scoffed. Sarah's upset? The audacity of that woman never ceases to amaze me. She's been worse lately, I admitted. Ever since I started looking more like Mom. I'd noticed it myself in the mirror. At 21, my features had settled into a striking resemblance to my mother's at that age. The few photographs I'd managed to save from Sarah's decluttering confirmed it. It's not just your looks, honey. Maggie tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so reminiscent of Mom that my chest tightened. It's your spirit, your kindness, your refusal to be erased. Sarah can't stand that Catherine lives on in you. Another text buzzed. Emma, come home now. This is childish behavior. I turned my phone face down on the coffee table. You know you can stay here tonight, Maggie offered. The guest room's a mess of canvases, but the bed's made. Thanks. I managed a small smile, feeling the first real relief since leaving home. I don't think I can face them tonight. Maggie nodded, then seemed to come to a decision. She set her mug down deliberately and fixed me with a penetrating look. Emma, how much do you remember about your mom's last months? The question caught me off guard. I remember she was sick, that she tried to stay positive. My throat tightened. That Sarah was her hospice nurse before everything. Before she miraculously became your father's shoulder to cry on? Maggie's voice carried an edge I rarely heard. Aunt Mags, what are you getting at? She sighed deeply, pushing herself up from the couch. I've been waiting for the right time, and maybe there isn't one. But after tonight, you need to know the truth. I watched as she crossed to the antique secretary desk in the corner and unlocked the bottom drawer with a small key she kept on her keychain. From inside, she withdrew something that made my heart skip. A wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its lid carved with my mother's initials. CLM Catherine Lynn Matthews. Mom's memory box, I whispered. Maggie nodded as she carried it, carefully back to the couch. She asked me to keep it safe until you were old enough to understand what's inside. I think that time is now. The box was heavier than it looked as she placed it in my lap. The wood was warm, as if it had absorbed some of my mother's essence over the years. I traced the initials with my finger, remembering how she used to carve little wooden figures for me when I was small. "She made this herself, you know," Maggie said softly. "After her diagnosis. Worked on it in secret during her good days." My fingers hovered over the simple brass latch. "What's inside?" "The truth," Maggie replied simply. "About Sarah. About your mom's final months. About things your father chose not to see." A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the room. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "You came here tonight for a reason, Emma." Maggie covered my hand with hers. "You're standing at a crossroads. One path leads back to that house, back to pretending along with your father that everything's fine. The other path?" She nodded toward the box. "It's harder, but it leads to truth. And Catherine believed you deserved that." The weight of the decision pressed on me. Part of me wanted to retreat, to maintain the fragile peace I'd managed to construct around my mother's absence. But Sarah's words echoed in my mind. "You're turning into her." Maybe it was time to understand exactly what that meant. "Will you look through it with me?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Maggie squeezed my hand every step of the way. I took a deep breath and unlatched the box. The hinges creaked softly as I lifted the lid, releasing the faint scent of cedar and my mother's favorite lavender hand cream. On top lay an envelope with my name written in Mom's graceful handwriting. "She wrote that the week before she died," Maggie explained. "Made me promise not to give it to you until you were ready to know everything." With trembling fingers, I lifted the envelope. Beneath it, I could see a small journal, what looked like greeting cards, photographs, and what appeared to be a small digital voice recorder. "This will take time to go through," Maggie said gently. "And it's getting late. Why don't you read the letter tonight, and tomorrow we can look at the rest together?" I nodded, feeling both eager and terrified to read my mother's last words to me. As if sensing my emotional exhaustion, Maggie stood and stretched. "I'll make up the guest room. There's clean towels in the bathroom cabinet if you want to wash up." She paused at the hallway. "And Emma? Your mother was the strongest person I've ever known. Sarah can say what she wants, but you becoming like Catherine? That's the highest compliment anyone could give you." After she left the room, I sat holding the unopened letter, listening to the familiar sounds of Aunt Maggie moving around the house. The creak of the linen closet, water running in the bathroom, her soft humming as she worked. My phone buzzed again with texts I refused to read. Tonight, I was safe. Tomorrow, I would learn the truth. I carefully returned everything to the box except the letter, which I slipped into my pocket. Tomorrow would be soon enough to dive into those waters. For now, I needed the sanctuary that Aunt Maggie's house provided, a place where my mother's memory wasn't treated like a shameful secret. As I followed Maggie to the guest room, I passed the hallway lined with family photos she defiantly displayed. Pictures of Mom and me at the beach, Mom and Maggie as teenagers with their arms thrown around each other, all three of us at my high school graduation just months before Mom's diagnosis. In every photo, my mother smiled with a brightness that contradicted Sarah's revisionist history of her as troubled and difficult. The contrast between these images and the carefully curated narrative in my father's house couldn't be starker. "She's still here, you know," Maggie said, catching me studying a particular photo of Mom laughing in a summer garden. "Not just in those pictures or that box. In you. In me. In the truth that's going to come out." For the first time since the slap that had sent me fleeing from my own home, I felt something other than hurt and confusion. Something that felt dangerously like resolve. "Sarah has no idea what's coming, does she?" I asked quietly. Maggie's smile held no humor, only determination. "Neither does your father. But they're both about to find out." Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Aunt Maggie's guest room. casting delicate patterns across the quilt. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The slap, the drive, the wooden box. My mother's letter lay on the nightstand where I'd placed it the night before. I hadn't found the courage to open it yet. Some part of me feared that once I read those words, everything would change irreversibly. The aroma of coffee and something baking drew me to the kitchen, where I found Aunt Maggie already dressed in another pair of paint-splattered overalls, her hair now contained in a colorful scarf. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, sliding a plate of blueberry muffins across the counter. "Figured we might need fuel for today." "I haven't opened the letter yet," I admitted, accepting the coffee she offered. "I know." She gave me a gentle smile. "Your mom was the same way. Always needed to prepare herself before facing difficult things." After breakfast, we settled at the kitchen table, the wooden box between us. 6 missed calls from my father glared from my phone screen, along with a message from Sarah claiming I'd caused a scene and owed them both an apology. I silenced the phone and slid it away. "Ready?" Maggie asked softly. I nodded, finally taking out my mother's letter. The envelope felt both fragile and impossibly heavy in my hands. With a deep breath, I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the pages covered in my mother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then Maggie has decided you're ready for the truth. I hope you're sitting down, sweetheart, because what I'm about to tell you isn't easy. By now, Sarah Winters has likely become a permanent fixture in your life. Perhaps she's even become your stepmother, as I've suspected she's intended all along. I need you to understand that Sarah is not who she pretends to be." When I first met Sarah at the hospital, I was grateful for her care and attention. Your father was struggling to balance work and my illness, and Sarah seemed like a godsend. But I soon began noticing disturbing patterns. My medication would leave me feeling worse, not better, on the days when Sarah administered it. Personal items would go missing. Your father would mention conversations with Sarah about my difficult behavior that never happened. I began keeping this journal when I realized something wasn't right. The voice recordings were my insurance, proof that I wasn't imagining things as Sarah suggested to your father. Look at the dates, Emma. Compare what was happening to me with Sarah's increasing presence in our home. I have no proof beyond what you'll find in this box. But I believe with my whole heart that Sarah deliberately inserted herself into our family with the intention of taking my place. And I fear she accelerated my decline to make it happen faster. I'm not asking you to seek vengeance, sweetheart. I'm asking you to protect yourself and, if possible, to help your father see the truth before it's too late. Sarah is dangerous in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Remember who you are, Emma. Remember who I am. Don't let her erase either of us. All my love, always. My hands trembled so badly that Maggie gently took the letter from me before it could fall. The room seemed to spin as my mother's words echoed in my mind. I believe she accelerated my decline. Did you know? I finally managed to ask Maggie, my voice barely audible. She nodded slowly. Not at first. Catherine only confided in me a few weeks before she died. By then, she was so weak, and your father was so completely under Sarah's influence. Her voice trailed off. I tried to talk to him, but he accused me of being jealous of Sarah's positive relationship with Catherine. He said you were just grieving and looking for someone to blame when you tried to keep Sarah away after the funeral, I remembered, the pieces finally fitting together. Emma, honey, look at me. Maggie waited until I met her eyes. We don't have absolute proof of what Sarah did. What we have is circumstantial evidence and your mother's suspicions. But what we know for certain is that Sarah manipulated her way into your family and has been systematically erasing Catherine from your lives. I reached for the journal that lay in the box. Let's see what Mom documented. The journal started 3 months before her death, around the time Sarah had become her primary home hospice nurse. The early entries were lucid and detailed, describing Sarah's seemingly excessive interest in our family photos, her questions about our routines, and her growing closeness with my father. April 15th. Sarah brought James coffee again this morning. She's learned exactly how he likes it. When I mentioned that I could tell her these things, she smiled and said, "Oh, I think James and I communicate just fine." Something in her tone made me uncomfortable. April 29th. Noticed my pain medication isn't working as effectively. Sarah. Insists it's just my bodybuilding tolerance, but Dr. Miller just adjusted the dosage last week. When I asked to call him, Sarah said she'd already consulted him and he didn't recommend changing anything yet. Somehow I doubt this conversation happened. As the journal progressed, my mother's handwriting became shakier, her thoughts sometimes disjointed, but her suspicions grew clearer. May 10th. Sarah accidentally broke the anniversary vase James gave me. She was profusely apologetic, but I saw her smile when she thought I wasn't looking. May 18th. Sarah told James I had a confused episode and thought she was trying to hurt me. I never said this. I asked her why my evening pills looked different. She's telling him I'm becoming paranoid. He believes her. The final entries were almost illegible, written with a desperately shaking hand. June 2nd. Emma visited after school. Sarah was angry, said she was disrupting my rest. Managed to whisper to Emma to remember who she is, who I am. Don't know if she understood. God, please let her understand someday. June 3rd. Can barely write. Something wrong with new IV meds. Sarah started, feeling worse. James won't listen. Got Maggie's number. Called when Sarah out. That was the last entry. My mother had died on June 5th. Wordlessly, Maggie reached into the box and withdrew the small digital voice recorder. She managed to record some conversations. Do you want to hear them? I wasn't sure I could bear it, but I nodded anyway. Maggie pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the kitchen. Weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. Sarah, these aren't my regular pills. The pain medication is supposed to be oval, not round. A smooth, falsely cheerful voice responded. Sarah, sounding quite different from her carefully modulated tone in our house. Catherine, we've talked about this. Dr. Miller changed your prescription. You're getting confused again. I spoke to Dr. Miller yesterday when you went to get coffee. He said he hasn't changed anything. A pause, then Sarah's voice hardened. That's not possible. You haven't been alone to make any calls. My sister was here. She let me use her phone. Another pause, longer this time. I think we need to talk to James about reducing your visitors. They're clearly agitating you and making your confusion worse. Don't you dare try to isolate me from my family. My mother's voice, though weak, carried a fierce determination that brought tears to my eyes. Sarah's laugh was cold. Your family? Catherine, let's be realistic. You're not going to be part of this family much longer. James will need someone strong beside him. Emma will need a mother figure. Stay away from my daughter. It's already too late, Sarah replied, so softly I had to strain to hear it. James already turns to me first, and when you're gone, I'll make sure he remembers you as you are now. Difficult. Paranoid. A burden, not the woman he married. The recording ended. I sat frozen, my mother's desperate warning and Sarah's chilling promise reverberating in my mind. There's more, Maggie said quietly, pulling out a manila envelope. Medical records Catherine managed to get copies of. Notes from her doctor expressing concern about her rapid decline. A letter from her regular nurse questioning why Sarah had requested to be Catherine's exclusive caregiver despite hospital protocol. We spent the next hour going through each document, piecing together a horrifying picture. While there was no smoking gun proving Sarah had deliberately hastened my mother's death, the pattern was unmistakable. She had systematically isolated my mother, gaslighted her, and positioned herself as indispensable to my father. "I found this too," Maggie said, hesitantly pulling out a folder labeled Sarah Winters, Background. Inside was a private investigator's report my mother had apparently commissioned in her final weeks. It revealed that Sarah Winters had been involved with at least 2 other vulnerable patients who had lost their spouses to illness. In both cases, she had formed relationships with the widowers shortly after their losses. "Mom knew," I whispered. "She knew exactly what Sarah was doing, and no one believed her." "I believed her," Maggie said firmly. "But by the time she shared her suspicions, she was so sick that your father had completely bought into Sarah's narrative that Catherine was becoming mentally unstable. I thought of all the times over the past 3 years that Sarah had casually mentioned my mother's difficulties near the end, her confusion, her paranoia. How she'd convinced my father, and to some extent me, that Mom hadn't been herself in those final months. "What do we do with all this?" I asked, overwhelmed by the weight of these revelations. Maggie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That's up to you, Emma. Your mother wanted you to know the truth, but she didn't expect you to carry this burden alone." I looked down at the scattered evidence of my mother's final battle, a battle she'd fought while dying, while being systematically undermined by the woman who had already set her sights on replacing her. Anger rose in me, burning away the shock. And confusion. "Dad needs to see this," I said firmly. "All of it." "Are you sure? James has spent 3 years believing Sarah's version of events. People don't easily admit they've been so thoroughly deceived." "I don't care if it's difficult for him," I replied, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "Mom fought to document the truth while she was dying. The least he can do is look at the evidence." Maggie studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. And you know what? You look exactly like your mother did when she decided to fight back against Sarah. That strength, that's what Sarah saw last night when she slapped you. That's what she meant when she said you're turning into Catherine." I began carefully organizing the items from the box, separating out the most compelling evidence. She meant it as an insult, but it's the greatest compliment she could have given me. "So what's the plan?" Maggie asked. I looked at my watch. It was just past noon. "They'll both be gone until evening. Dad has his Thursday client meetings, and Sarah has her book club." I'd memorized their schedules years ago to minimize contact with my stepmother. "I'm going to set everything up in the living room. When they come home, they'll find the truth waiting for them." "I'm coming with you," Maggie said immediately. I shook my head. "No, this is something I need to do alone." I gathered my mother's journal, the voice recordings, the medical records, and the investigator's report. "But I'll call you the minute I leave the house." As I packed the evidence into my backpack, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For 3 years, I'd tiptoed around Sarah, accepted my father's emotional abandonment, and tried to preserve my mother's memory in the privacy of my own heart. Those days were over. It was time for the truth to see the light of day. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as I pulled up to the house. My childhood home, once a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, now seemed like a fortress of secrets. I sat in my car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, gathering courage for what I was about to do. No cars in the driveway. Good. Just as I'd predicted, both Dad and Sarah were still out. I used my key to enter through the side door, the one that led directly into the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, pristine in that artificial way Sarah preferred. No dishes in the sink, no mail scattered on the counter. Even the fruit in the bowl looked arranged rather than simply placed. The lasagna dish from last night's disastrous dinner had been washed and returned to its cabinet as if nothing had happened. as if I hadn't been slapped across the face in this very room less than 24 hours ago. I set my backpack on the kitchen table and took a deep breath. This was my last chance to turn back, to maintain the fragile piece of denial that had sustained our household for 3 years. But Mom's words echoed in my mind. Remember who you are. Remember who I am. Resolved, I began unpacking the evidence I'd brought from Aunt Maggie's. I'd thought carefully about where to set up my silent confrontation. Not in the dining room, where last night's humiliation was still too fresh. Not in my father's study, where Sarah had gradually replaced family photos with her preferred artwork. No, there was only one place that felt right: the living room. It was the heart of our home, where we'd spent countless evenings before Mom got sick. It was also where she'd spent her final weeks in the hospital bed, insisting on being surrounded by family life rather than dying in a sterile facility. And most importantly, it was the one room Sarah had never fully managed to remake in her own image. Mom's reading chair still sat by the window, though Sarah had recovered it. The bookshelves still held Mom's beloved classics, though Sarah had rearranged them by color rather than author. I moved deliberately, transforming the coffee table into a careful, curated display. First, I placed Mom's journal in the center, opened to one of the most damning entries, where she described Sarah swapping her medications. Around it, I arranged the medical records, with key sections highlighted. The doctor's concerns about her unexplained rapid decline, the notes questioning Sarah's exclusive access to Mom's care. Next came the private investigator's report on Sarah's suspicious pattern with other widowers. I deliberated before adding a post-it note. Ask her about Thomas Garfield and William Henderson, the names of the other men she'd targeted after their wives' deaths. From my backpack, I pulled out the item that had cost me a small fortune last Christmas, a digital picture frame. Sarah had dismissed it as tacky when I'd given it to Mom, but Mom had treasured it, filling it with family photos Dad had long since put away. I'd rescued it from the donation box after Sarah's post-funeral decluttering. I plugged it in and set it on the end table, where it began cycling through images of our family when we were whole. Mom and Dad dancing at their anniversary party, Mom teaching me to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies, all 3 of us camping by the lake. Reminders of the woman Sarah had tried to erase. Finally, I set up the small cassette player Aunt Maggie had dug out of her attic, an old-school device that would play the voice recordings Mom had secretly made. Beside it, I placed a notepad with timestamps and brief descriptions of what each recording contained. 17 p.m. Sarah discussing replacing Mom in the family 5:32 p.m. Sarah admitting to isolating Mom from visitors 7:05 p.m. Sarah threatening Mom when confronted about medication. I stepped back to survey my work. The coffee table now held the undeniable evidence of Sarah's manipulation and possible crimes. But something was missing. Something personal that would cut through my father's willful blindness. From my wallet, I withdrew the photo I always carried. With me, the last picture taken of Mom and me together at my 16th birthday, just before her diagnosis. We stood with our arms around each other, laughing at some forgotten joke, our matching hazel eyes crinkled at the corners, identical, dimples in our left cheeks. The resemblance that had so infuriated Sarah last night was captured perfectly in this image. I propped it against the cassette player with a simple note. This is who I'm becoming. This is who she was. My phone buzzed. A text from Dad. We need to talk about last night. Coming home early. Be there by 6. It was already 5:30. Time was running out. I needed to add one final touch to ensure they couldn't simply sweep this under the rug. I took out my mother's letter, made a photocopy for myself at the small desk in the corner, and then placed the original prominently atop the journal. Her handwriting, elegant even as she weakened, would be immediately recognizable to my father. He wouldn't be able to dismiss it as forgery or fabrication. Lastly, I wrote my own letter. Not a long explanation or emotional plea. Those words would come later, when I was ready. Instead, I wrote simply, "Dad, Mom tried to tell you. Now she's telling you again, through the evidence she gathered while dying. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to believe her. I'll be at Aunt Maggie's when you're ready to talk." Emma, I placed my letter alongside my mother's and took one final look at the tableau I'd created. In the fading afternoon light, the truth lay exposed on the coffee table, impossible to ignore, undeniable in its collective weight. The distant sound of a car engine made my heart race. They were coming home earlier than expected. I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. This confrontation needed to unfold without my presence, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. I quickly gathered my backpack and headed for the back door. As I stepped outside, I caught a glimpse of Sarah's silver sedan turning onto our street. I ducked behind the row of hedges separating our yard from the neighbors, my heart pounding as I made my way to where I'd parked my car around the corner. I drove away. I could see Sarah's car pulling into the driveway in my rearview mirror. Dad's navy blue Camry was right behind her. They'd arrived together, probably coordinating their approach to dealing with my childish behavior from last night. I imagined them entering the house, calling my name, checking my bedroom. I pictured their conversation as they made their way to the living room, perhaps to sit and strategize about how to handle me. And then I imagined their faces as they saw what awaited them. Would Sarah try to whisk it all away before Dad could examine it? Would she attempt to discredit everything as the delusions of a sick woman? Or would the sheer volume of evidence finally crack the careful facade she'd constructed? And Dad? Would he finally see the truth he'd been avoiding for 3 years? Would he recognize how thoroughly he'd been manipulated? Would he remember the woman he'd once loved enough to stand up for her memory? I didn't know the answers yet, but for the first time since Mom died, I felt like I was truly honoring her, not just remembering her, but fighting for her truth the way she had fought in her final weeks. My phone began ringing as I pulled into Aunt Maggie's driveway. Dad's name flashed on the screen. It had taken them less than 20 minutes to find my display. I silenced the call, not ready for that conversation yet. He immediately called back, then again. Then a text. "Emma, what is all this? Call me right." Now, another call. Then from Sarah's number. "You had no right to go through Catherine's private things. This is completely inappropriate." I turned off my phone as I walked up to Aunt Maggie's porch. She opened the door before I could knock, concern etched on her face. "They found it," I said simply. She nodded, ushering me inside. And now we wait. We settled in her living room, the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner, marking the minutes of this strange limbo. I felt oddly calm, as if a burden I'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. "What do you think will happen?" I asked Maggie as she handed me a cup of tea. She considered this, her artist's eyes thoughtful. "Best case? Your father finally sees Sarah for who she truly is. Worst case? He chooses his comfortable delusion over the uncomfortable truth. And if it's the worst case, then you'll know you did everything you could to honor your mother." She squeezed my hand. "And you'll still have me. We'll figure out what comes next together." The thought was both comforting and painful. I'd always imagined that once Dad knew the truth, everything would somehow return to normal, or at least to a new normal where my mother's memory was respected. I hadn't allowed myself to consider that he might choose Sarah over the truth, and how. Hour passed, then another. My silenced phone continued to light up with calls and texts, but I wasn't ready to look at them yet. The confrontation I'd staged needed time to sink in. As evening settled fully around us, Aunt Maggie's landline rang, startling us both. She answered, her expression giving nothing away as she listened. "Yes, she's here," she said finally. "No, I don't think that's a good idea right now. Because she needs time, James, just like you do. I understand, but... She sighed deeply. Fine. Hold on. She held out the phone to me. Your father. He says he's coming over. Says he needs to talk to you face to face. I took the phone, my hand trembling slightly. Dad? His voice sounded strange, strained and hoarse as if he'd been crying. Emma, what you left? I need to see you. To talk about all this. Is Sarah coming with you? I asked, the question revealing my deepest fear. A long pause. No, she's not. Another pause. She's packing her things. The simple sentence hit me like a physical force. I gripped the edge of the side table to steady myself. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said quietly. Is that okay? Yes, I managed to reply. After hanging up, I looked at Aunt Maggie, unable to find words for the mix of emotions flooding through me. Relief, vindication, grief for what could have been if he'd seen the truth 3 years ago. He's coming, I finally said. And Sarah, she's leaving. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. Your mother would be so proud of you, Emma. So proud. As we waited for my father to arrive, I thought about the silent confrontation I'd orchestrated, evidence carefully arranged to speak the truth when I couldn't find the words. My mother had done the same in her final days, documenting what was happening when no one would listen to her spoken concerns. Like mother, like daughter. Sarah's angry words from last night took on a new meaning now. You're turning into her. Yes. Yes, I was. And I couldn't imagine a greater compliment. The headlights swept across Aunt Maggie's living room as Dad's car pulled into the driveway. I stood by the window, watching him sit motionless behind the wheel for several long moments before finally turning off the engine. He looked smaller somehow, hunched over the steering wheel, his face illuminated briefly by the screen of his phone before darkness enveloped the car again. Do you want me to give you two some privacy? Aunt Maggie asked, hovering uncertainly near the hallway. I shook my head. No, I'd like you to stay. After everything that had happened, I didn't quite trust myself to face this conversation alone. The slow, heavy tread of Dad's footsteps on the porch stairs seemed to match the pounding of my heart. 3 soft knocks. Then Aunt Maggie opened the door. Dad stood on the threshold, looking more disheveled than I'd seen him since Mom's funeral. His shirt was partially untucked, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his eyes that shocked me most, red-rimmed and haunted, as if he'd aged a decade in a single evening. Emma, he said, my name, barely audible on his lips. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across Aunt Maggie's small entryway. All the carefully rehearsed words I'd planned vanished, leaving only raw emotion in their wake. Come in, James, Maggie finally said, breaking the silence. I've made coffee. We settled in the living room, the same spots where Aunt Maggie and I had examined Mom's memory box that morning. Dad perched on the edge of the armchair, looking like he might bolt at any second. I don't know where to begin, he said finally, staring down at his untouched coffee. How about with Sarah? I suggested, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He flinched slightly at her name. She's gone. After I listened to the recordings, I confronted her. She denied everything at first. Tried to say your mother was confused, delusional. He swallowed hard. But when I mentioned the other men, the other widowers in the investigator's report, something changed in her face. It was like a mask slipping. What did she say? I asked. That's just it. She didn't deny it. He looked up, his expression bewildered. She laughed, said I was pathetically easy compared to the others, that Catherine had been surprisingly resilient despite her efforts. The casual cruelty of Sarah's confession made my blood run cold. So she admitted it? To all of it? Dad nodded slowly. Not in so many words, but yes. When I told her to get out, she didn't even argue. Just said I'd regret choosing a ghost over a real woman. His voice broke on the last words. Aunt Maggie made a small, disgusted sound. That woman is a predator, James. She targeted you when you were at your most vulnerable. I let her do it, he whispered. I let her erase Catherine. I let her abuse my own daughter. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face now. Emma, how can you ever forgive me? The question hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to rush to comfort him, to say of course I forgave him, but the bruise on my cheek, now faded to a dull yellow, reminded me of 3 years of small betrayals that had culminated in last night's dinner. I don't know yet, I answered honestly. I want to, but it's going to take time. He nodded, accepting, this without protest. I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness anyway. It's not about deserving, I said. It's about rebuilding. If that's something you want to do. More than anything, he replied immediately. We talked for hours that night. Dad described how he'd found my display in the living room, how he'd initially been angry, thinking I was trying to stir up trouble. But then he'd seen Mom's handwriting on the letter, and something had compelled him to read it despite his reluctance. It was like hearing her voice again, he said. So clear, so certain. Nothing like the confused, medicated woman Sarah kept describing to me. He'd moved methodically through each piece of evidence, the journal entries, the medical records, the investigator's report, but it was the recordings that had finally shattered his denial completely. Hearing Catherine's voice, hearing her so afraid, but still trying to protect our family. He shook his head, unable to continue. What happens now? I asked when the conversation finally circled back to the present. I've called a lawyer, he said. Not just about the divorce, about what Sarah might have done to your mother, the medication tampering. There might be enough evidence for a criminal investigation. You believe she hastened Mom's death? The question that had haunted me all day finally found voice. Dad's face crumpled. I don't know for certain, but your mother believed it, and after today, I believe her. He took a shaky breath. The police may not find enough evidence after all this time, but they should at least investigate, for Catherine's sake. Aunt Maggie reached over and squeezed his hand, a small gesture of forgiveness that brought fresh tears to his eyes. There's something else, he said, pulling a business card from his pocket. I found a therapist who specializes in family trauma. I've already made an appointment for myself, but I was hoping maybe we could go together too. Try to rebuild what we've lost. The simple request, so unlike the emotionally distant father I'd known for the past 3 years, caught me off guard. I'd like that, I managed to say. It was nearly midnight when Dad finally left, promising to call in the morning. As Aunt Maggie and I prepared for bed, exhausted by the emotional marathon of the day, she handed me a small wrapped package. Your mother wanted you to have this when the time was right, she explained. I think that time is now. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When I opened it, I found a tiny photo of Mom on one side, and on the other, inscribed in miniature letters. Remember who you are. She had it made after her diagnosis, Maggie explained. Said she wanted you to carry her heart close to yours, even when she couldn't be here. I fastened it around my neck, the cool silver warming against my skin. Thank you for keeping it. Safe all this time? That's what family does, she replied simply. 6 months passed, each day bringing small steps toward healing. The police investigation into Sarah's actions was ongoing, complicated by the passage of time, but the detective assigned to the case seemed determined to uncover the truth. Dad and I attended therapy together twice a month, slowly rebuilding trust in careful, sometimes painful conversations. He had started individual therapy as well, working through his grief and guilt with a dedication that I couldn't help but admire. Sarah had disappeared from our lives completely, though the shadow of her manipulation lingered in subtle ways. Moments when Dad would retreat into silence, times when I found myself flinching at sudden movements. But there were good changes, too. Dad had repainted the kitchen the sunny yellow Mom had chosen years ago. Photos of her reappeared throughout the house. He'd even started cooking again, simple meals that often went wrong in comical ways, but the effort meant everything. One bright Sunday morning in October, Dad knocked on my bedroom door, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from my favorite cafe. "Thought we might visit Mom today," he said, handing me one of the cups. "If you'd like to." An hour later, we stood before her headstone, the autumn leaves creating a colorful carpet around the grave. Dad had brought fresh flowers, dahlias, her favorite, and I had brought Mom's memory box. "Do you think she'd mind if we looked through this together?" I asked as we settled on the small bench nearby. Dad shook his head, his eyes soft. "I think she'd be happy we're finally facing the truth together." We spent the afternoon there, sharing stories as we examined each item in the box. Dad filled in details I hadn't known about Mom's life before me, showed me wedding photos I'd never seen, and read love letters he'd written her during their early days together. "I want you to have these," he said, carefully returning the letters to their envelopes. "To know who she really was, who we were together." As the afternoon light began to fade, Dad placed his hand gently on Mom's headstone. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you," he whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't listen." "She knew you loved her," I said, slipping my hand into his. "Even at the end, she never doubted that." He squeezed my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt the connection between us strengthening rather than fraying. As we walked back to the car, the memory box tucked safely under my arm, Dad paused. "Emma, there's something I've been wanting to tell you." I waited, watching the emotions play across his face. "When Sarah said you were turning into your mother," he took a deep breath. "It's the truest thing she ever said. You have Catherine's strength, her compassion, her inability to look away from the truth even when it hurts." His voice wavered. "And I couldn't be prouder of the woman you're becoming." The words washed over me, healing places inside I hadn't realized were still wounded. I fingered the locket at my throat, the message inside a constant reminder of all I carried forward. Remember who you are. Remember who I am. As we drove home in the gathering dusk, I realized that remembering wasn't enough anymore. Now it was. Time to build something new, a future where my mother's memory was honored, where truth had replaced deception, where my father and I could grow into the family we were meant to be. It wouldn't be easy. Some days would still hold echoes of pain. The investigation into Sarah's actions might never bring the complete justice Mom deserved. But looking at Dad as he drove, humming softly to a song Mom used to love, I knew we had already taken the hardest step, facing the truth that had been waiting for us all along.